I need to tell you what happened that night. What my own son-in-law did to me in front of my entire family, and how my daughter just stood there and watched. This story has been eating at my heart for weeks now, and I can't keep it inside anymore. It was our annual Christmas party. I had spent 3 days preparing everything in my home. The turkey, the stuffing, the cranberry sauce, all the traditional dishes my family has always loved. The house was decorated with twinkling lights and garland, and I had even bought new china for the occasion. Everything had to be perfect, because family means everything to me, or at least I thought it did. My daughter Sarah arrived with her husband Michael around 6 o'clock. I could smell the alcohol on him immediately. That sharp, bitter scent of whiskey mixed with beer. His eyes were already glassy, and he had that arrogant swagger he gets when he's been drinking. But it was Christmas, and I wanted peace in my home, so I smiled and welcomed them just like I always do. The evening started well enough. My grandchildren were playing in the living room, their laughter filling the house with joy. My sister and her husband were there, along with my brother and several cousins. We were all gathered around the dining table, sharing stories and enjoying the feast I had prepared with so much love and care. That's when Michael started getting louder. He began making crude jokes that made everyone uncomfortable. He criticized the food, saying the turkey was too dry and the potatoes needed more salt. Each comment felt like a slap in the face, but I bit my tongue. Sarah said nothing, just kept her eyes down on her plate like she always does when he acts this way. Then he started complaining about the seating arrangement. He said he deserved to sit at the head of the table, not me, because he was the man of the family now. The room went quiet. Even the children stopped playing. Everyone could feel the tension building like a storm about to break. I stood up to clear some dishes, trying to diffuse the situation. That's when it happened. As I walked past his chair carrying a stack of plates, he suddenly pushed his chair back hard, blocking my path completely. I stopped and politely said, "Excuse me, Michael, could you please let me through?" He looked up at me with those cold, drunk eyes and said the words that will haunt me forever. "You old witch, get out of my way." And then, before I could even process what was happening, he shoved me with both hands. I lost my balance immediately. The plates crashed to the floor as I fell backward, my hip hitting the hardwood with a sickening thud. Pain shot through my entire body as I lay there on my own dining room floor, surrounded by broken china and scattered food. The silence that followed was deafening. 23 people at my Christmas table, and not a single person moved to help me at first. But the worst part, the part that breaks my heart every single day, is what I saw when I looked up from that cold floor. My daughter Sarah was standing right there, just 2 feet away from me. She had seen everything. She had heard every cruel word, and she did absolutely nothing. She just stood there next to her husband like a statue, her face blank, her hands at her sides. That moment changed everything between us forever. The cold hardwood floor beneath me felt like ice against my skin. I could feel the dampness from the spilled gravy soaking through my new Christmas dress, the one I had bought specifically for this evening because I wanted to look elegant for my family. My hip throbbed with a pain so sharp it took my breath away, and I could already feel the bruise forming along my entire left side. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what I felt in my heart as I lay there, looking up at the faces staring down at me. Some showed shock, others embarrassment, a few genuine concern. My sister Martha immediately rushed to my side, her face pale with horror. "Oh my God, are you hurt?" she whispered, kneeling beside me and gently touching my shoulder. My brother Tom stood up so fast, his chair fell backward, his fists clenched, ready to confront Michael. Yet through all of this chaos, all I could see was my daughter Sarah. My precious Sarah, whom I had carried for 9 months, whom I had rocked to sleep every night as a baby, whom I had nursed through every childhood illness, whom I had worked 3 jobs to put through college. She stood frozen like a mannequin, her husband's hand now possessively gripping her arm as if claiming ownership over her reaction. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could hear my own labored breathing, the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, and somewhere in the distance, one of my grandchildren asking, "Why is Grandma on the floor?" The innocence in that small voice broke something inside me that I don't think will ever fully heal. Michael didn't apologize. He didn't even look ashamed. Instead, he took another swig from his beer bottle and muttered something about me being dramatic and playing the victim. The audacity of his words hit me like a second blow. Here I was, a 72-year-old woman lying on my own dining room floor, surrounded by broken dishes and ruined food, and he had the nerve to suggest I was overreacting. My sister and brother helped me to my feet, their gentle hands supporting my trembling body. Every movement sent waves of pain through my hip and back. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond, what I would do next. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand that Michael leave my house immediately, to banish him from our family forever. But another part of me, the part that had spent decades keeping peace in this family, wondered if I should just pretend nothing had happened. That's when I looked at Sarah again, hoping against hope that she would finally speak up, that she would defend her mother who had given her everything. Our eyes met for just a moment, and in that instant, I saw something that chilled me to my core. It wasn't just fear or shock in her expression. It was calculation. She was weighing her options, deciding whether defending me was worth the consequences she might face at home with her husband. And then she made her choice. Sarah looked away, turned slightly toward Michael, and in the quietest voice imaginable said, "Maybe we should just continue with dinner." Not, "Are you okay, Mom?" Not, "Michael, how dare you touch my mother?" Not even, "I think you should apologize." Just a suggestion that we all pretend this nightmare hadn't happened. The room erupted then. My brother Tom stepped forward, his voice shaking with rage. "You need to get out of this house right now," he told Michael. "And you need to apologize to your mother-in-law immediately." My sister Martha was helping me to the couch, her own voice trembling as she said, "I can't believe what I just witnessed. This is assault." But Michael just laughed. That cruel, dismissive laugh that had become so familiar over the years. "Oh, please," he said. "I barely touched the old woman. She's fine. Look at her. She's already standing up." He gestured toward me with his beer bottle as if I were some circus act performing for his amusement. That word, old woman, hit me like a physical slap. I had raised 4 children, built a successful career as a nurse, saved money my entire life, owned my home outright, and maintained my independence well into my 70s. I was nobody's old woman. I was a human being deserving of respect, especially in my own home, especially from someone I had welcomed into my family with open arms. The most devastating part was watching Sarah's face during this entire exchange. As her uncle defended me and her aunt comforted me, as other family members began choosing sides and voices raised in heated argument, she remained perfectly still. She didn't defend her husband, but she didn't defend me either. She simply stood there like a neutral observer at someone else's family crisis, as if she had no stake in what was happening, as if the woman bleeding on the floor wasn't the person who had given birth to her and sacrificed everything for her happiness. My grandchildren, Sarah's own children, were now crying. The 8-year-old kept asking what was wrong with Grandma, while the 5-year-old had hidden behind the Christmas tree, probably terrified by the sudden violence and shouting. These innocent babies were witnessing their grandfather figure assault their beloved grandmother, and their own mother was doing nothing to protect them from this trauma. As I sat on my couch, Martha pressing a bag of frozen peas against my growing bruise, I realized that this wasn't just about Michael's violence. This wasn't just about a man who drank too much and lost his temper. This was about my daughter making a choice, and she had chosen her abuser over her mother. She had chosen to protect the man who had just humiliated and physically hurt the woman who had given her life. In that moment, sitting in my own living room, surrounded by broken china and broken dreams, I understood that I had lost my daughter long before tonight. Michael hadn't just pushed me to the floor. He had revealed the truth about what my family had become. And Sarah's silence, her terrible, complicit silence, told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in her life. The party was over, but my real journey was just beginning. That night, after everyone had finally left and the house fell into an eerie silence, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by dirty dishes, and the lingering smell of spilled wine. My hip ached terribly, and I knew I would need to see a doctor in the morning. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation consuming my heart. I kept replaying that moment over and over again, trying to understand how the little girl I had raised with so much love could have stood there and watched her own mother being humiliated without saying a single word. I raised her, you know. I raised Sarah with my own 2 hands, through sleepless nights and worried days, through scraped knees and broken hearts, through teenage rebellions and college anxieties. When her father walked out on us when she was only 12 years old, I became both mother and father to her. I worked double shifts at the hospital, sometimes 16 hours a day, just to make sure she had everything she needed. While other kids were getting dropped off at school by their parents, Sarah was getting dropped off by her mother, who had already worked all night saving other people's lives. I remember the countless times I went without so that she could have more. I wore the same 3 dresses to work for 2 years straight because every extra penny went toward her school supplies, her field trips, her graduation dress. When she wanted to take piano lessons like her friends, I picked up weekend shifts at a nursing home across town, mopping floors and changing bedsheets for minimum wage, just so I could pay for those lessons. My hands were raw and cracked from all the cleaning chemicals, but hearing her play for Elise at her first recital made every sacrifice worth it. When she graduated high school as valedictorian, I cried tears of pure joy and pride. This brilliant, beautiful young woman was my greatest achievement. I had raised her to be strong, independent, and compassionate. I had taught her to stand up for what was right, to never let anyone treat her poorly, to value herself and demand respect from others. At least, I thought I had taught her those things. College was another sacrifice. I took out a second mortgage on this house, the house where she had grown up, the house where I had planned to live out my golden years in peace. I wanted her to have every opportunity I never had, to never have to choose between her dreams and financial reality the way I had been forced to do. 4 years of tuition, room and board, textbooks, and spending money. All while I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and drove a car that was held together with prayer and duct tape. When she met Michael in her senior year, I was genuinely happy for her. She seemed to glow when she talked about him, and I thought I saw something in her eyes that had been missing since her father left, a kind of security and contentment. He seemed charming enough when I first met him, polite and well-dressed, with a good job in accounting. He talked about taking care of Sarah, about building a future together, and foolishly, I thought this meant my daughter would finally have the stability and love she deserved. But even then, there were warning signs I chose to ignore. The way he would answer for her when I asked her direct questions, the way she gradually stopped calling me as frequently after they got engaged, the way she would make excuses when I invited them both over for dinner, saying Michael preferred to eat at home or was too tired after work. I told myself this was normal, that young couples needed space to build their relationships, that I was being an overprotective mother. The real changes began after their wedding. Sarah started canceling our weekly lunch dates, claiming she was too busy with her new life. When I would call to check on her, she seemed distant and distracted, always cutting our conversations short because Michael needed something or they had somewhere to be. The warm, open relationship we had always shared began to feel forced and superficial. I started noticing how she would glance at Michael before answering even the simplest questions, as if seeking his permission to speak. When I would suggest activities or outings, she would immediately say she needed to ask Michael first, even for things as innocent as going shopping for groceries together. The confident, independent young woman I had raised was slowly disappearing, being replaced by someone I barely recognized. There were moments when I caught glimpses of my real daughter underneath this new, diminished version of herself. Sometimes when Michael would step out of the room, her shoulders would relax and she would laugh like her old self, or share a memory from her childhood with genuine warmth. But the moment he returned, that spark would vanish, replaced by a careful, measured demeanor that broke my heart. I began to suspect that something was wrong at home, but every time I tried to broach the subject, she would shut down immediately. "Everything is fine, Mom," she would say with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Michael is a good husband. You worry too much." But a mother knows her child, and I could see the sadness she was trying to hide, the way she had learned to make herself smaller and quieter to avoid conflict. Tonight, watching her stand motionless as her husband knocked me to the ground, I finally understood the complete extent of what she had become. This wasn't just about a woman who was afraid to speak up for fear of consequences later. This was about a person who had been so systematically broken down that she no longer remembered what it meant to have a backbone, to stand up for what was right, to protect the people she claimed to love. The daughter I raised would have immediately helped me to my feet and demanded that Michael apologize. The daughter I raised would have told him to leave her mother's house immediately and never come back. The daughter I raised would have chosen her family over a man who showed such blatant disrespect and violence. But that daughter was gone, replaced by a stranger who could watch her own mother suffer and feel nothing but the urge to keep the peace at any cost. As I sat there in my empty kitchen, still wearing my ruined Christmas dress, I realized that I hadn't just lost my daughter tonight. I had been losing her slowly, piece by piece, for years, and I had been too blind to see it happening. The question now was whether the woman she had become was worth fighting for, or whether it was time for me to finally let go of the dream of having my real daughter back. That realization cut deeper than any physical wound Michael could have inflicted. As I sat there in the quiet darkness of my kitchen, my mind drifted back to the beginning, to the day I first held Sarah in my arms at the hospital. She was so tiny, so perfect, with her father's dark hair and my stubborn chin. I remember whispering to her that I would give her everything I never had, that she would never want for anything as long as I drew breath. Looking back now, I realize that promise became both my greatest joy and my biggest mistake. I was only 22 when Sarah was born, barely out of nursing school myself, married to a man who seemed loving and stable but turned out to be neither. Her father, Robert, was charming in the beginning, full of promises about the life we would build together. He talked about buying a house with a white picket fence, taking family vacations to the beach, saving money for our children's college education. For 3 beautiful years, I believed we were living that dream. But when Sarah turned 3, Robert started coming home later and later from his job at the insurance company. The smell of perfume on his shirts wasn't mine, and the credit card bills showed charges at restaurants I had never been to. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. He told me he had fallen in love with his secretary, that he was filing for divorce, and that he would be moving out that weekend. Just like that, 26 years old with a 3-year-old daughter and a mortgage I couldn't afford on my nurse's salary alone. I could have been bitter. I could have fallen apart. Many women in my situation did, and I wouldn't have blamed them. Instead, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I decided that Sarah would never suffer because of her father's abandonment. She would never feel unwanted, unloved, or lacking in any way. If I had to be both mother and father to her, then I would be the best single parent any child ever had. The first few years were the hardest. I was working 12-hour shifts at the hospital, sometimes picking up extra shifts on weekends just to make ends meet. My mother would watch Sarah during the day, bless her soul, but she was already in her 70s, and it wasn't fair to burden her with a toddler's energy. I remember coming home after working all night, exhausted beyond belief, and Sarah would run to me with her arms wide open, wanting to play dolls or read stories. No matter how tired I was, I never said no. Those precious moments with her were what kept me going through the darkest times. I started saving money from the moment Robert left, putting aside every spare penny I could find. I shopped at thrift stores for my own clothes, but bought Sarah new dresses for every school picture. I drove a 15-year-old Honda with a broken air conditioner for 8 years because every dollar I didn't spend on a car payment went into Sarah's college fund. I packed bologna sandwiches for my own lunch every single day, but made sure Sarah had hot meals from the school cafeteria so she wouldn't feel different from her classmates. When Sarah was 7, she wanted to take ballet lessons like her friend Jennifer. The classes cost $60 a month, which might as well have been $600 on my budget, but I found a way. I started cleaning houses on my days off from the hospital, scrubbing toilets and mopping floors for wealthy families who probably spent more on dinner than I made in a week. My back ached and my hands were raw, but watching Sarah's face light up as she practiced her pliés and pirouettes made every sacrifice worthwhile. High school brought new challenges and new expenses. Sarah needed a computer for her advanced placement classes, so I worked extra shifts for 3 months straight to buy her the best one I could afford. When she made the debate team and needed professional clothes for competitions, I took on weekend shifts at a nursing home across town. When she wanted to go on the senior class trip to Washington, D.C., I sold my grandmother's antique jewelry, pieces that had been in our family for generations, to pay for her ticket. But the biggest sacrifice came when it was time for college. Sarah had been accepted to a prestigious university 3 states away, her dream school that would give her the best education money could buy. The tuition was astronomical, more than I made in an entire year, but I was determined to make it happen. I took out a second mortgage on this house, the house where Sarah had grown up, the house where I had planned to spend my retirement in comfort and security. For 4 years, I lived like a pauper, so my daughter could live like a princess. I ate generic cereal for breakfast and dinner, saved every coupon I could find, and wore the same winter coat for 6 years. Meanwhile, Sarah was living in a beautiful dormitory, eating in the dining halls, joining sororities, taking spring break trips with her new friends. When she called home, she would tell me about her classes, her professors, the amazing opportunities she was being offered. And my heart would swell with pride even as my bank account dwindled to almost nothing. I told myself it was all worth it when she graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration. She looked so beautiful walking across that stage in her cap and gown, so confident and accomplished. I sat in the audience with tears streaming down my face, thinking about all the nights I had worked double shifts, all the sacrifices I had made, all the dreams I had deferred so that this moment could happen. After graduation, Sarah got a good job at a marketing firm in the city. I was so proud of her, so happy that all my hard work had paid off. She was finally independent, successful, living the life I had always dreamed she would have. I thought this was my reward, seeing her flourish and thrive in the world. But then Michael entered the picture, and everything began to change. At first, I was happy that she had found someone who seemed to care about her. I thought maybe now she would settle down, get married, give me some grandchildren to spoil in my old age. I had spent 30 years putting Sarah's needs before my own, and I was looking forward to a new chapter where I could finally focus on my own happiness and well-being. I never imagined that the man she chose would systematically erase everything I had taught her about strength, independence, and self-respect. I never thought that all my sacrifices, all my lessons about standing up for herself and demanding respect from others, would be undone by someone who claimed to love her. And I certainly never imagined that the daughter I had raised with such devotion and care would one day stand by silently while her husband physically assaulted the woman who had given up everything for her happiness. Sitting in my dark kitchen, still feeling the pain in my hip from where I had fallen, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake somewhere along the way. Had I loved her too much? Had I protected her so completely from life's hardships that she never learned how to fight for herself or others? Had my sacrifices made her weak instead of strong? The answers to those questions would determine everything that happened next. Michael wasn't always the monster he became tonight. When Sarah first brought him home to meet me 5 years ago, he seemed like the answer to a mother's prayers. He was well-dressed in a crisp navy suit, carried flowers for me and a bottle of expensive wine, and spoke eloquently about his career in accounting and his plans for the future. He looked me directly in the eyes when we shook hands, called me Mrs. Patterson with what seemed like genuine respect, and complimented my cooking throughout dinner. I remember thinking that night that my daughter had finally found a good man, someone who would cherish and protect her the way she deserved. But looking back now, I can see the subtle warning signs that I dismissed as minor personality quirks. During that first dinner, when Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom, Michael immediately began questioning me about her daily routines, her friends, her work schedule, her hobbies. At the time, I thought he was just being a caring boyfriend who wanted to understand his girlfriend better. I answered his questions openly, even proudly, thinking I was helping him learn how to make Sarah happy. I had no idea I was providing him with a detailed manual on how to control every aspect of her life. He also had this way of inserting himself into conversations that weren't about him. When Sarah would tell a story about her work or her friends, Michael would somehow redirect the focus back to himself, his opinions, his experiences. If Sarah mentioned enjoying a particular restaurant, Michael would immediately explain why a different restaurant was better. If she expressed interest in a movie, he would suggest a different film that he preferred. Again, I told myself this was just masculine confidence, the kind of take-charge attitude that many women found attractive in a partner. The changes in Sarah began gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice them at first. She had always been punctual for our weekly lunch dates, but suddenly she started arriving 15 or 20 minutes late, always with elaborate apologies about how Michael had needed something before she could leave the house. When I suggested we try a new restaurant or go shopping at a different mall, she would say she needed to check with Michael first to make sure he didn't have other plans for them. At first, I thought this was sweet, the consideration of a woman who was learning to think as part of a couple rather than as an individual. But then the cancellations started. Sarah would call an hour before our scheduled lunch to say that Michael had surprised her with tickets to a baseball game, or that he had invited his boss over for dinner and needed her help preparing. These last-minute changes happened more and more frequently, always with Michael's needs taking priority over our established plans. When I would express disappointment, Sarah would apologize profusely and promise to make it up to me next week. But next week would bring another excuse, another emergency that only she could handle for Michael. The most disturbing changes were in Sarah's appearance and demeanor. She had always been a confident dresser, favoring bright colors and fashionable styles that reflected her vibrant personality. But after a few months with Michael, her wardrobe became increasingly conservative and muted. She started wearing longer skirts, higher necklines, darker colors that seemed to drain the life from her complexion. When I complimented a new dress or asked about a particular outfit, she would mention that Michael preferred more classic styles, that he thought bright colors were unprofessional or inappropriate for a woman her age. Her conversation changed too. Sarah had always been opinionated and articulate, passionate about politics, social issues, and current events. She would argue with me about everything from healthcare policy to environmental protection. And I loved those spirited debates because they showed her intelligence and independent thinking. But gradually, those conversations became one-sided, with Sarah nodding along to whatever opinion I expressed, rather than engaging with her own perspective. When I would ask her directly what she thought about a particular issue, she would say she needed to discuss it with Michael first, or that she was still forming her opinion and didn't want to speak prematurely. The isolation was perhaps the most insidious change of all. Sarah had always maintained close friendships with her college roommates, her work colleagues, and several neighbors in her apartment building. She would tell me stories about their weekend adventures, their dinner parties, their group vacations. But after Michael entered her life, these friends began disappearing from her conversation. When I would ask about Jennifer or Lisa or Amanda, Sarah would make vague comments about being too busy to see them, or mention that Michael didn't particularly enjoy their company. Slowly but surely, her social circle shrank until it consisted almost entirely of Michael's friends and Michael's family. The financial control was more subtle, but equally effective. Sarah had always been responsible with money, maintaining her own checking and savings accounts, paying her own bills, and making her own purchasing decisions. But after she moved in with Michael, she started asking me for small loans, $20 or $50 here and there, always with explanations about unexpected expenses or temporary cash flow problems. When I offered to help her create a budget or suggested she might want to maintain separate accounts for personal expenses, she would deflect the conversation, saying that Michael handled all their finances and that she trusted his judgment completely. The most heartbreaking change was in her relationship with me. We had always been close, talking on the phone several times a week, sharing everything from workplace gossip to personal dreams. But Michael's presence created an invisible barrier between us that grew thicker with each passing month. Our phone conversations became shorter and more superficial, with Sarah always seeming distracted or in a hurry to end the call. When I would try to have deeper conversations about her happiness or her future plans, she would give me rehearsed-sounding answers that felt hollow and disconnected from the daughter I knew. Looking back, I realized that Michael's true nature revealed itself in small moments that I should have recognized as red flags. The way he would interrupt Sarah when she was speaking, finishing her sentences, or correcting her recollections of events. The way he would make dismissive comments about her job, her friends, or her interests, always delivered with a smile that was supposed to soften the blow, but never quite succeeded. The way he would make decisions for both of them without consulting her, then present these decisions as if they had been mutual choices. I remember one particular incident about 2 years ago that should have been my wake-up call. We were having dinner at my house, and Sarah mentioned that she was thinking about taking a painting class at the community college. She had always been artistic as a child, and I was thrilled to hear her expressing interest in something creative again. But Michael immediately launched into a lecture about how art classes were a waste of time and money, how Sarah was too practical to indulge in such frivolous pursuits, and how she would be better served spending her evenings helping him with his work projects. The light in Sarah's eyes dimmed as he spoke, and she never mentioned the painting class again. That night, I should have taken my daughter aside and asked her directly if she was happy, if Michael was treating her well, if she felt free to make her own choices. Instead, I told myself that all couples have different dynamics, that what matters is that they love each other, and that I shouldn't interfere in their relationship. My silence that night was the first step in my own complicity with what Michael was doing to my daughter. Tonight, when he knocked me to the ground in my own home while Sarah stood paralyzed and silent, I finally understood that the charming young man I had welcomed into our family 5 years ago was nothing more than a predator who had systematically destroyed my daughter's spirit, her independence, and her ability to stand up for what was right. He hadn't just isolated her from her friends and family, he had isolated her from herself, from the strong, confident woman I had raised her to be. The man who assaulted me tonight wasn't having a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by too much alcohol. He was showing me exactly who he had always been underneath the polite facade, and exactly what he had been doing to my daughter behind closed doors for years. But even understanding Michael's true nature couldn't prepare me for the devastating reality of my daughter's response to what happened tonight. As I lay there on my dining room floor, surrounded by broken china and spilled food, staring up at the faces of my family members, the one face that haunted me most was Sarah's. Not because of what I saw there, but because of what I didn't see. There was no shock, no outrage, no protective instinct rising to defend her mother. There was only a terrible, practiced emptiness, as if she had learned to shut down completely in moments of crisis. She didn't move. Not a single step toward me as I struggled to breathe through the pain shooting up my hip and spine. Not a hand extended to help me to my feet. Not even a flinch when her husband called me an old witch and shoved me with enough force to send me crashing to the ground. She simply stood there like a statue, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes focused on some point just past my shoulder, as if by not looking directly at me, she could pretend this wasn't happening. The silence that followed my fall seemed to stretch on forever, but during those endless seconds, I watched my daughter's face transform through a series of micro-expressions that told me everything I needed to know about what our relationship had become. First came a flash of what might have been concern, so brief I almost missed it. Then calculation, as she glanced quickly between Michael and me, weighing her options. Finally, resignation, as she made the conscious choice to remain motionless and voiceless while her mother lay injured on the floor. When my sister Martha rushed to my aid and my brother Tom jumped up to confront Michael, Sarah's response was to step closer to her husband, positioning herself slightly behind him as if seeking his protection rather than distancing herself from his violence. The symbolism of that movement cut through me like a knife. In that gesture, she was choosing sides, and she had chosen the man who had just assaulted her mother over the woman who had sacrificed everything for her happiness. What made her silence even more devastating was the context of our family dynamics. Sarah had never been a passive person, at least not before Michael entered her life. As a child, she was the first to speak up when she witnessed unfairness, whether it was a playground bully picking on a smaller child or a teacher treating a student unfairly. In high school, she had organized protests against the school dress code that she felt was discriminatory. In college, she had been actively involved in student government and social justice causes. The woman I raised would have immediately intervened if she saw anyone being treated the way I was treated tonight, let alone her own mother. Even more heartbreaking was remembering all the times throughout her life when Sarah had turned to me for protection and support. When she was 8 years old and her father didn't show up for her school play as promised, I was the one who held her while she cried and assured her that she was loved and valued. When she was 16 and her first boyfriend broke up with her via text message, I was the one who spent the entire night talking her through her heartbreak and helping her understand that she deserved better treatment from the people in her life. When she was in college and struggling with a particularly difficult professor who seemed to have it in for her, I was the one who helped her navigate the situation and advocate for herself. For 29 years, I had been Sarah's safe harbor, her advocate, her fiercest protector. I had taught her that family stands up for family, that we defend the people we love even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. I had modeled strength and resilience for her, showing her through my actions that women don't have to accept poor treatment from anyone, regardless of the relationship or the circumstances. Yet when it came time for her to apply those lessons, when her own mother needed protection and advocacy, she chose silence. The most painful part of her reaction wasn't just what she failed to do, but the skill with which she managed to detach herself from the situation emotionally. This wasn't the paralysis of shock or the confusion of someone witnessing unexpected violence. This was the practiced numbness of someone who had learned to survive by shutting down her natural emotional responses. She had been trained, through months or years of psychological conditioning, to prioritize Michael's comfort over everyone else's safety, including her own mother's. As I watched her stand there in her careful stillness, I realized that the daughter I thought I knew had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. The confident, compassionate young woman I had raised had been systematically broken down and rebuilt into someone whose first instinct was to protect her abuser rather than defend his victim. She had been taught that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for justice, that maintaining her relationship was more valuable than maintaining her integrity. But what haunted me most was the possibility that her silence represented something even worse than fear or conditioning. What if she had simply stopped caring about me altogether? What if Michael's influence had been so complete that she no longer felt any emotional connection to the woman who had given birth to her, raised her, and sacrificed everything for her well-being? What if, in her mind, I had become nothing more than an inconvenience, an embarrassing reminder of a life she had moved beyond? The thought that my own daughter might have watched me being humiliated and hurt and felt nothing but annoyance at the disruption to her evening was almost more than I could bear. It suggested a level of emotional disconnection that went beyond abuse or control into something that felt like genuine indifference. And if that was the case, if Sarah truly no longer cared about me as a person, then everything I had believed about our relationship, every assumption I had made about the bond between a mother and daughter, had been a delusion. As my family members helped me to the couch and the evening deteriorated into arguments and accusations, Sarah maintained her position next to Michael, saying nothing, contributing nothing, participating in nothing except the protection of the man who had just committed an act of violence in my home. Even when the conversation turned to whether they should leave or whether someone should call the police, she remained silent, letting Michael speak for both of them, letting him make decisions about their response to his own criminal behavior. By the time they finally left that night, Sarah still hadn't spoken a single word to me. No apology for her husband's actions, no inquiry about my injuries, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had even occurred. She simply gathered her purse and coat, kissed her children goodbye with the same mechanical affection she had shown all evening, and walked out of my house as if nothing had changed between us. But everything had changed. Her silence tonight had spoken louder than any words could have. It told me that the daughter I had loved and nurtured and protected for nearly 3 decades was gone, replaced by a stranger who could watch her own mother being abused and feel nothing but the need to maintain her own precarious security. It told me that all my sacrifices, all my love, all my hopes for our future relationship had been wasted on someone who no longer existed. The question now was what I was going to do with this devastating knowledge, and whether the woman Sarah had become deserved any consideration in the decisions I would make going forward. 3 days passed in relative silence after that disastrous Christmas evening. 3 days of me sitting alone in my house, nursing my bruised hip and my wounded heart, thinking about everything that had happened and everything that needed to happen next. I spent those days moving slowly through my daily routines, drinking my morning coffee while staring out the kitchen window, tending to my small garden despite the winter cold, organizing and reorganizing my closets as if keeping my physical space in order could somehow restore order to my emotional world. During those quiet hours, I found myself experiencing a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in years. The shock and hurt of Christmas night had given way to something much more powerful and focused. For the first time since Sarah had brought Michael into our lives, I wasn't making excuses for anyone's behavior or trying to preserve family harmony at the expense of my own dignity. I was simply thinking, planning, and preparing to take action that would change everything between us forever. On the morning of the 4th day, I picked up my phone and began making calls. My voice was steady and warm as I spoke to each family member, inviting them to a special lunch at my house that Sunday. I told my sister Martha that I wanted to bring everyone together to clear the air after what had happened on Christmas, to make sure there were no lingering hard feelings or family divisions. I assured my brother Tom that I was feeling much better physically, and that I thought it would be good for all of us to have a peaceful meal together. I even called my cousins and their spouses, explaining that family was too important to let one difficult evening damage our relationships permanently. Most importantly, I called Sarah. When she answered the phone, her voice was tentative and cautious, as if she wasn't sure whether I would be angry with her or Michael, whether I would demand apologies or explanations she wasn't prepared to give. Instead, I spoke to her with the same gentle tone I had used when she was a child and needed comfort after a nightmare. I told her that I loved her and missed her, that I understood that Christmas had been difficult for everyone, and that I hoped we could all move forward together as a family. I invited her and Michael and the children to join us for Sunday lunch, promising that there would be no confrontations or uncomfortable conversations, just good food and family time. Sarah seemed genuinely surprised by my calm demeanor and gracious invitation. She had probably expected tears, demands for apologies, or angry accusations about her failure to defend me. Instead, she found a mother who seemed to have processed the events of Christmas night and emerged from them with a spirit of forgiveness and reconciliation. She accepted the invitation eagerly, probably relieved that our family crisis appeared to be resolving itself without requiring her to take any difficult stands or make any uncomfortable choices. Throughout the week leading up to the lunch, I threw myself into preparations with an energy and attention to detail that surprised even me. I planned an elaborate menu featuring all of Sarah's favorite dishes from childhood. The honey-glazed ham that she had always requested for special occasions. The sweet potato casserole with the marshmallow topping that she used to help me prepare when she was learning to cook. The homemade dinner rolls that I had taught her to braid when she was 10 years old. The chocolate cake with vanilla buttercream frosting that had been her birthday request every year from age 5 to 15. I spent hours cleaning and polishing my house until every surface gleamed. I arranged fresh flowers in every room, lit scented candles that filled the air with the warm fragrance of vanilla and cinnamon, and set my dining room table with my finest china and crystal. I pressed my best tablecloth, polished the good silver, and arranged the place settings with the careful precision of someone hosting a formal dinner party. Everything had to be perfect, elegant, and beautiful. This meal needed to be memorable for all the right reasons before it became memorable for all the wrong ones. During those days of preparation, I found myself thinking constantly about the legal documents sitting in my safe deposit box at the bank. My will, which I had updated just 2 years ago, leaving everything to Sarah and Michael. My life insurance policies, with Sarah as the sole beneficiary. The deed to this house, which I had always planned to transfer to Sarah when I passed away. The investment accounts and savings bonds that represented a lifetime of careful financial planning and sacrifice, all intended to provide security and comfort for my daughter and her family after I was gone. I had worked with my attorney to structure everything in a way that would give Sarah and Michael immediate access to substantial assets, enough money to pay off their mortgage, fund their children's college educations, and live comfortably for the rest of their lives. I had imagined Sarah receiving this inheritance as a final gift of love from a mother who had spent her entire adult life putting her daughter's needs before her own. I had pictured her standing in this house after my funeral, surrounded by my possessions and my memories, feeling grateful for everything I had provided and proud of the woman I had raised her to become. But Christmas night had changed everything. As I polished my grandmother's silver and arranged my mother's china, I realized that the woman who would inherit these treasures was no longer the daughter I had raised with such love and sacrifice. The woman who had stood silently while her husband assaulted her mother didn't deserve to benefit from a lifetime of maternal devotion and financial planning. The woman who had chosen to protect her abuser rather than defend her victim had forfeited any claim to the legacy I had spent decades building for her benefit. On Saturday afternoon, I drove to my attorney's office and spent 2 hours making the necessary changes to my estate planning documents. The process was surprisingly simple and straightforward. A few signatures, a couple of witnesses, some official notarization, and 30 years of financial planning had been completely redirected. When I walked out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in months, as if I had finally taken control of a situation that had been controlling me for far too long. That evening, as I put the finishing touches on my preparations for Sunday's lunch, I practiced what I would say to my family. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and rehearsed the words I had been composing in my mind for days, making sure my voice would remain calm and steady when the moment came. I tried different approaches, different tones, different ways of explaining my decision that would be clear and decisive without being cruel or vindictive. I wasn't planning to humiliate Sarah or Michael publicly. I wasn't seeking revenge or trying to punish them for their behavior on Christmas night. I was simply taking back control of my own life and my own legacy, making decisions based on the reality of who my daughter had become rather than the fantasy of who I had hoped she would remain. After 68 years of putting other people's needs before my own, after 30 years of sacrificing my own security and comfort for Sarah's benefit, I was finally making a choice that reflected my own values and protected my own dignity. As I went to bed Saturday night, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow would bring shock, anger, and probably the end of my relationship with Sarah and Michael forever. But it would also bring justice, closure, and the satisfaction of knowing that I had finally stood up for myself in a way that truly mattered. After a lifetime of giving everything away, I was about to take something back. And the anticipation of that moment filled me with a strength I had forgotten I possessed. Sunday arrived with crisp winter sunshine streaming through my kitchen windows as I put the finishing touches on what would become the most important meal I had ever prepared. By noon, the house was filled with the rich aromas of honey-glazed ham, sweet potato casserole, and fresh dinner rolls, creating an atmosphere of warmth and celebration that belied the gravity of what was about to unfold. Everything was perfect, exactly as I had planned, exactly as it needed to be for this final act of maternal love and ultimate disappointment. The family began arriving at 1 o'clock, and I greeted each person with genuine warmth and affection. My sister Martha brought her famous green bean casserole, commenting on how wonderful I looked and how beautifully I had set the table. My brother Tom arrived with a bottle of wine and a concerned inquiry about my hip, which I assured him was healing nicely. My cousins and their spouses filled the house with laughter and conversation, everyone seemingly relieved that our family crisis appeared to have resolved itself peacefully. Sarah and Michael arrived at exactly 1:15 with their 2 children, and I watched carefully as they entered my home for what I knew would be the last time. Sarah looked nervous, but hopeful, dressed in a conservative navy dress that I recognized as one of the outfits Michael had encouraged her to buy during their early months together. She hugged me gently, asking again about my injuries and telling me how grateful she was that I had organized this gathering. Michael shook my hand with what appeared to be genuine remorse, mumbling something about everyone having had too much to drink on Christmas and hoping we could put the whole unfortunate incident behind us. I smiled graciously at both of them, accepted their token apologies with the grace of a hostess who understood that family harmony was more important than personal grievances, and ushered them into the dining room where the rest of our family was already gathering. For the first hour of our meal, I played the role of devoted mother and grandmother perfectly, asking about the children's school activities, complimenting Sarah's new haircut, and even engaging Michael in polite conversation about his work projects. The children, my precious grandchildren, were delighted to be surrounded by their extended family and completely oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that had marked our recent interactions. My 8-year-old grandson regaled us with stories from his science class, while my 5-year-old granddaughter showed off the new dance moves she had learned in her ballet lessons. Watching their innocent joy and excitement reminded me of why this moment was so important. Why I needed to take a stand that would either preserve their future relationship with a grandmother who respected herself, or protect them from witnessing further episodes of violence and disrespect in their family environment. As we finished the main course and I began clearing dishes with help from Martha and my cousins, I noticed that the conversation had become more relaxed and natural than it had been in months. Michael seemed genuinely at ease, probably believing that his Christmas night behavior had been forgiven and forgotten. Sarah was more animated than I had seen her in years, laughing at her uncle's jokes and sharing memories of past family gatherings with her cousins. Even the children were more comfortable than they had been during recent visits, no longer walking on eggshells around their stepfather's unpredictable moods. It was precisely this atmosphere of restored family harmony that made what I was about to do so dramatically effective. I had timed this moment carefully, waiting until everyone had eaten well, until the wine had made them relaxed and content, until they were all gathered around my dining room table, feeling secure in the assumption that our family bonds had survived their recent testing and emerged stronger than before. I stood up slowly, using my grandmother's sterling silver spoon to gently tap against my crystal water glass, creating the soft, chiming sound that had always been our family's signal for important announcements during special occasions. The room gradually quieted as all eyes turned toward me, their faces reflecting pleasant anticipation of what they assumed would be a toast to family unity, or perhaps an expression of gratitude for their presence in my home today. "I want to thank all of you for being here today," I began, my voice steady and warm, carrying just the right tone of maternal authority mixed with genuine affection. Family has always been the most important thing in my life, and seeing all of you around this table brings me more joy than you could possibly imagine. I have spent my entire adult life working to build something meaningful that I could pass on to the people I love most in this world. I paused here, looking around the table at each face, allowing my gaze to linger particularly on Sarah and Michael, who were both smiling expectantly, probably assuming this was leading towards some sort of reconciliation speech that would officially put Christmas night behind us forever. Many of you know that I have worked very hard throughout my life to accumulate some modest wealth and property that I hoped would provide security and comfort for my family after I am gone. I have always taken great pride in knowing that my sacrifices and careful planning would allow my daughter and her family to live without financial worry, to give my grandchildren opportunities I never had, and to maintain this house and its memories for future generations. Sarah's smile was growing broader now, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand affectionately, probably interpreting my words as a public affirmation of her importance in my life and my continued commitment to her family's future security. Michael was nodding approvingly, perhaps calculating in his mind the value of the inheritance he assumed was still coming his way. "However," I continued, and the single word hung in the air like a thunderclap, immediately changing the energy in the room as everyone sensed that this speech was about to take an unexpected turn. The events of Christmas evening have forced me to reconsider not just my relationship with certain family members, but also my responsibility to ensure that my life's work benefits people who share my values of respect, dignity, and family loyalty. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though they couldn't understand exactly what. Sarah's hand froze in mine, and I could see confusion beginning to replace the contentment in her expression. Michael's nodding had stopped completely, and he was now staring at me with the first hint of concern creeping into his features. I spent this week visiting with my attorney and making some important changes to my estate planning documents. I had originally written my will, leaving everything to my daughter Sarah and her husband Michael, including this house, my investment accounts, my life insurance policies, and all of my personal possessions. But after careful consideration and much prayer, I have decided that my legacy should instead benefit people who would truly honor the values and sacrifices that made that legacy possible. The room erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs as the implications of my words began to sink in. Sarah's face had gone completely white, and her hand pulled away from mine as if I had suddenly burst into flames. Michael's expression was transforming rapidly from confusion to disbelief to something that looked very much like barely controlled rage. Therefore, I concluded, my voice remaining calm and steady despite the chaos beginning to unfold around me, I have decided to leave my entire estate to St. Catherine's Women's Shelter, a non-profit organization run by Catholic nuns that provides safety, support, and resources to women and children who are victims of domestic violence. I believe this organization will use my life savings to help people who truly need protection and advocacy. People who understand the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult or dangerous to do so. The explosion of voices that followed my announcement was immediate and overwhelming. But through it all, I remained standing at the head of my table, finally feeling like the strong, dignified woman I had raised my daughter to become. The first sound to break through the stunned silence was a strangled gasp from Sarah, followed immediately by the crash of Michael's chair as he pushed back from the table so violently that it toppled over backward. The contrast between these two reactions told me everything I needed to know about how each of them was processing my announcement. Sarah was experiencing the emotional devastation of realizing that her mother had just publicly rejected everything she thought their relationship represented, while Michael was responding with the raw fury of a man who had just watched a fortune slip through his fingers. "You can't be serious," Michael said, his voice rising to a level that made both children immediately look frightened and confused. "You can't just give away everything we've been counting on, everything Sarah deserves as your daughter. This is insane. This is some kind of emotional breakdown you're having because of what happened at Christmas. You need to think about this rationally. Think about your family's future." But before I could respond to his outburst, my brother Tom stood up from his seat at the far end of the table, his face flushed with what I recognized as righteous indignation mixed with enormous pride. "She sounds perfectly rational to me," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed everything that led to this moment. "In fact, this is the most sensible thing I've heard anyone say in years. Eleanor, I think you've made a brilliant decision, and I'm proud of you for having the courage to make it." My sister Martha was nodding vigorously in agreement, her eyes bright with tears that I realized were tears of admiration rather than sadness. "I watched what happened here on Christmas night," she said, addressing the entire table but looking directly at Sarah and Michael. "I saw a man assault his elderly mother-in-law in her own home, and I saw a daughter stand by and do nothing while her mother was hurt and humiliated. If that's the kind of family loyalty you two understand, then Eleanor's money will do far more good helping women who actually know how to protect and defend each other." The children were becoming increasingly agitated by the raised voices and obvious conflict, and I could see my 5-year-old granddaughter starting to cry. Sarah finally seemed to shake off her initial shock and moved to comfort her daughter, but her movements were mechanical and distant, as if she was operating on autopilot while her mind struggled to process what was happening to her life. "Mom, please," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a desperation that cut through all the other noise in the room. "Please don't do this. I know Christmas was terrible. I know I should have done more, said something, defended you somehow. But I was scared and confused, and I didn't know what to do. Please don't punish me forever for one moment of weakness. I'm still your daughter. I still love you, and I'm begging you to reconsider this decision." For a moment, hearing those words from my daughter, I felt my resolve waver. This was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of her failure that I had heard from her since Christmas night, and part of me wanted to believe that this crisis might finally wake her up to what she had become. But then I looked at Michael's face, saw the calculation behind his rage, the way he was already formulating arguments and strategies to change my mind, and I realized that nothing fundamental would change between them. Sarah's fear and confusion weren't about recognizing her husband's abusive behavior. They were about learning that there would be consequences for enabling it. "Sarah," I said gently, sitting back down in my chair and speaking to her with the same tone I had used when she was a child and needed to learn a difficult but important lesson. "I have spent 30 years of my life sacrificing everything for your happiness and security. I worked multiple jobs. I went without food and proper clothing. I mortgaged my future and my retirement to give you every opportunity I never had. And I did it gladly, because I believed I was investing in a daughter who would grow up to be strong, independent, and morally courageous." The room had grown quieter now, with everyone listening intently to what felt like the most important conversation any of us had ever witnessed. Even Michael seemed to understand that interrupting this moment between mother and daughter would only damage his cause further. But the woman who stood in my dining room on Christmas night and watched her husband knock her mother to the ground without saying a single word is not the daughter I raised, I continued, my voice steady, but filled with a sadness that came from the deepest part of my heart. That woman is someone I don't recognize, someone whose values and priorities are so different from mine that I cannot in good conscience leave her my life's work. I am not punishing you for one moment of weakness, Sarah. I am acknowledging years of choices you have made that have turned you into someone I never intended to create. Michael's restraint finally snapped completely. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table so hard that several glasses jumped and my grandmother's crystal water pitcher cracked audibly. "You're a bitter old woman who can't stand to see her daughter happy with someone else. You've always resented our marriage, always tried to interfere in our relationship, and now you're using this whole Christmas thing as an excuse to get revenge on us for not letting you control our lives." The silence that followed Michael's outburst was different from the previous silences we had experienced. This wasn't the quiet of shock or surprise. This was the heavy, dangerous quiet that comes when someone has revealed exactly who they are and everyone in the room is processing the implications of that revelation. My cousins were staring at Michael with expressions of disgust and disbelief. My brother Tom looked like he was physically restraining himself from getting up and confronting Michael directly. Even Sarah seemed stunned by her husband's words, as if she was hearing him speak about her mother this way for the first time and realizing how it sounded to other people. But it was my sister Martha who provided the perfect response to Michael's tantrum. She stood up slowly, walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of him, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried the power of absolute moral authority. "Young man," she said, "you just proved everything Eleanor said about you. A decent person would be apologizing right now, begging for forgiveness, promising to change their behavior and earn back the respect they lost. Instead, you're shouting at the woman you assaulted, calling her names, and making demands about money that was never yours to begin with. You have shown everyone in this room exactly why you don't deserve one penny of Eleanor's hard-earned savings." The truth of Martha's words hung in the air like a verdict that could not be appealed or overturned. Michael's face was red with fury and humiliation, but he seemed to finally understand that every word he spoke was only making his situation worse. Sarah was staring at her husband as if seeing him clearly for the first time, and I could see something shifting in her expression that gave me the first glimmer of hope I had felt in years. The meal that was supposed to restore our family harmony had instead revealed all the fault lines that had been hidden beneath the surface of our relationships. But for the first time since Christmas night, I felt like the truth was finally being spoken, and the people who truly mattered in my life were standing with me rather than against me. Whether Sarah would find the courage to join them remained to be seen. The silence that followed Martha's devastating words stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but I could see the wheels turning in everyone's minds as they processed not just what had been said, but what it all meant for our family going forward. The children had stopped crying and were now clinging to their mother, sensing that something fundamental was changing in their world, but unable to understand exactly what. Michael stood frozen behind his overturned chair, his face cycling through emotions as he realized that his tantrum had not only failed to change my mind, but had actually sealed his fate in front of the only witnesses who mattered. But it was Sarah's reaction that held my complete attention. I watched as 30 years of conditioning and compromise warred with the values I had tried so hard to instill in her during her childhood. Her eyes moved from Michael's furious face to the broken crystal on my table, to the frightened expressions of her children, to the supportive faces of her aunt and uncle, and finally back to me. In that moment, I could see her struggling to reconcile the man she had married with the man her family was describing, trying to understand how the person she had chosen to build a life with could be so completely rejected by everyone else she had ever loved. Then something remarkable happened. Sarah took a deep breath, gently moved her children to stand behind their Uncle Tom, and walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of Michael. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than it had been all afternoon, but it carried a strength I hadn't heard from her in years. "Michael," she said, looking directly into his eyes, with a steadiness that reminded me powerfully of the confident young woman she used to be. "I need you to leave my mother's house right now. Take your coat and your keys and go home. I'll bring the children later tonight after I've had a chance to talk with my family." The shock on Michael's face was absolute. In 5 years of marriage, I don't think Sarah had ever contradicted him publicly or made a unilateral decision about anything important. His mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words that would reassert his control over the situation, but for once in his life, he seemed to understand that he had pushed things too far and that continuing to argue would only make everything worse. "Sarah, you can't be serious," he said, but his voice lacked the commanding tone he usually used with her. Instead, it carried a note of pleading that revealed how much his confidence had been shaken by the unified opposition of her family. "We need to talk about this privately, work through this together as a couple. Your mother is obviously having some kind of emotional breakdown, and we need to support each other through this crisis." But Sarah was shaking her head before he finished speaking. "No, Michael, we don't need to work through anything together right now. You assaulted my mother in her own home, and instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, you just proved everything she said about you by calling her names and making demands about money that was never ours to begin with. I need time to think about what that means for our marriage and our family." The word marriage hung in the air like a question that might soon have a very different answer than anyone had expected when this day began. Michael seemed to realize that he was losing control not just of the inheritance he had been counting on, but potentially of his wife and stepchildren as well. His desperation was becoming more obvious with each passing moment. "Sarah, please," he said, reaching for her hand, but she stepped back just far enough to avoid his touch. "Don't let them poison your mind against me. We've built a good life together, we have plans for the future, we love each other. Don't throw all of that away because of one mistake I made when I had too much to drink." But even as he spoke these words, I could see that Sarah was no longer really listening to him. Instead, she was looking around my dining room, taking in the scene of destruction he had created, the overturned chair, the broken crystal, the frightened faces of her children, the disappointed expressions of her extended family. For the first time in years, she was seeing the situation through eyes that weren't clouded by his manipulation and control. "One mistake?" she repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Michael, you called my mother an old witch and knocked her down in front of her entire family. That's not a mistake someone makes because they've had too much to drink. That's who you really are when you think no one important is watching." The truth of her words seemed to hit Michael like a physical blow. He looked around the room desperately, searching for someone, anyone, who might support his version of events or offer him a lifeline out of the hole he had dug for himself. But every face he encountered reflected the same mixture of disgust, disappointment, and determination to support my decision. Finally, he seemed to understand that he had lost completely. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and when he spoke again, his voice was bitter and resentful rather than pleading. "Fine," he said, grabbing his coat from the back of his chair. "But don't come crying to me when you realize what you're giving up. Don't expect me to take you back when you figure out that your precious family can't pay your bills or give you the life I've provided." These final words revealed everything anyone needed to know about Michael's true character and his real feelings about his marriage to Sarah. Even in defeat, he couldn't resist trying to make her feel guilty for choosing her family over him, couldn't stop himself from making threats designed to undermine her confidence in her decision. But instead of weakening Sarah's resolve, his parting shot seemed to strengthen it. "Goodbye, Michael," she said simply, and there was a finality in those two words that suggested she might be saying goodbye to more than just this particular afternoon. After he left, the atmosphere in my dining room changed completely. The tension and anger that had filled the space for the past hour dissipated, replaced by something that felt almost like relief. Sarah returned to her children and held them close, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay, that Mommy just needed to have some important conversations with Grandma and the rest of the family. We spent the next 2 hours around that table, talking more honestly than we had in years. Sarah asked questions about my decision to change my will, and I explained not just what I had done, but why I felt it was necessary. She listened without arguing or trying to change my mind, seeming to understand for the first time that this wasn't about punishment or revenge, but about ensuring that my life's work would benefit people who shared my values. She also talked about her marriage, acknowledging things she had never been willing to admit before about Michael's controlling behavior, his isolation of her from friends and family, his gradual erosion of her confidence and independence. It was painful to hear, but it was also healing to finally have these conversations in the open with the support and love of people who had been watching her struggle for years. As the afternoon turned to evening and it came time for everyone to leave, Sarah hugged me longer and tighter than she had in years. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered in my ear. "Thank you for loving me enough to show me the truth, even when it was hard for both of us." I knew then that regardless of what happened with her marriage, regardless of whether she would ever receive the inheritance I had redirected to St. Catherine's, I had accomplished something far more important than financial planning. I had helped my daughter find her way back to the person I had always hoped she would become. Now, 3 months later, as I sit here in my quiet kitchen writing down this story, I can tell you that Sarah filed for divorce 2 weeks after that Sunday lunch. She and the children have moved into a small apartment across town, and while money is tight, she seems happier and more confident than I've seen her in years. She visits me regularly, brings the grandchildren for dinner every weekend, and we're slowly rebuilding the relationship that I thought Michael had destroyed forever. The women's shelter has already put my future donation to good use, expanding their counseling services and opening a new transitional housing program that will help dozens of families escape dangerous situations and build new lives. Knowing that my life savings will continue to protect and empower women long after I'm gone brings me a peace I never expected to feel. Sometimes people ask me if I regret my decision, if I wish I had found a way to help Sarah without giving up the financial security I had planned to leave her. The answer is simple. The greatest gift I could give my daughter wasn't money or property or even this house full of memories. It was showing her that she had the strength to choose dignity over security, truth over convenience, and self-respect over false peace. Blood may be family, but respect is a choice. And I chose myself. In doing so, I helped my daughter learn to choose herself too. If you're facing a similar situation, if someone in your life is treating you or your loved ones with disrespect or violence, please remember that you don't have to accept it just because they're family, or because leaving seems too difficult or too expensive. There are people and organizations ready to help you, just like St. Catherine's Women's Shelter helped me find the courage to take action when action was needed. Your dignity is worth more than any inheritance. Your safety is more important than keeping peace. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst behavior, even when that refusal comes at great personal cost. I hope my story helps you find the strength to make the right choice for your own life. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you all. Este bloco final oferece uma resolução emocionalmente satisfatória que transforma a narrativa de vingança em uma jornada de crescimento e libertação. A protagonista não apenas recupera sua dignidade, mas também salva sua filha de um relacionamento destrutivo, demonstrando que às vezes o maior ato de amor maternal é ter coragem suficiente para confrontar a verdade, mesmo quando isso causa dor inicial. A mensagem final de empoderamento e esperança eleva a história pessoal para uma chamada universal à ação contra a violência doméstica e o abuso psicológico.